Attention listeners, mark your calendars for Colorado Gives Day on December 10th. Support Aftersight and give to the causes you care about. Go to coloradogivesday.org/organizations/Aftersight between now and December 10th to make your donation.
Hey, you're listening to Blindsight. Let's go. Mental health isn't something to take lightly. It's time to fight. It's time to thrive. Let's do this.
Welcome to Blindsight. This is your host, Bill Lundgren, and with me is the co-host, Jonathan Price, and we'll be continuing what we started in previous episode, but we'll be talking about dealing with abuse in a way of healing from the abuse. And we'll be talking about some techniques. We'll be talking about things you need to know in terms of being able to go to the therapist. And hopefully we'll be able to help clear up some misconception. And we'll be talking about something called EMDR, and that's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And that's an important new thing in trauma healing. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things is that in the last few years, certainly I've noticed, trauma treatment has become the thing of much discussion and much training. We didn't have that kind of thing when I was, practicing, getting started. Now, in the last couple of years, everybody's been talking about trauma, and it's almost like if you have a hangnail, that's traumatic, and you need to go to treatment for that. And we won't, we're not going that far. But it is an important thing because we're discovering how many people have experienced some kind of trauma and able to label it because they don't know what happened, but they know something happened and don't know what to do about it. Mm-hmm. So, Jonathan, welcome to the program again as the co-host, and also an important part of our discussion, because it's one thing to talk academically about trauma. Mm-hmm. It's quite another to talk about with someone who's been through it and has healed from it.
Absolutely. So I want to give kind of a quick history. We were talking about EMDR. This might intrigue some people. EMDR it has kind of a funny story, but go back and read it. The founder, or the person who discovered, I guess, EMDR, or developed it, Francine Shapiro, she was kind of walking around in a forest and realized that a lot of her traumas, or her mind cleared up when she would move her eyes quickly back and forth. And so she got really curious about it, and she decided that she was going to start discovering what this meant and how she could apply this. And this actually came about, and most of this work was done in the early 80s to late 80s, and it started with PTSD patients. Mm-hmm. So people who were in military mainly, and then only in the recent years has it become sort of mainstream, like you had said, and more of a practice thing in clinical circles. The one caveat is this is a very, very hyper-specific modality. Not all therapists are trained in EMDR. You have to find somebody who is trained in EMDR because it is very, very intense. Just putting it out there straight up front, it's not for the weak, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's only for those people who want, and I have to emphasize, want to get better, who want to heal, who want to move forward. Otherwise, it will not work. But I'm just we're going to set that expectation and leave that right there.
Well, I think I would add a little bit more to that, and that is in the last year, I've been seeing more and more of the training program providing certification.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
for EMDR. So one of the things when you decide you want to work with a counselor, or you're working with a counselor, and he or she is suggesting EMDR, that's a good way to make sure that the person has the training, is if they're certified in it.
Yeah.
And right now they're doing a lot of certifications in a lot of areas, and that's one of the important ones. And I think I will add on to what you were saying. Your best bet is to work with a counselor and get that relationship with a counselor. Find a counselor who's experienced in this area or in the area that you think is problematic, and work with that counselor and develop a supportive relationship between the two of you. Because going into the trauma can be difficult, because when you think about it, what happens when you have a trauma, you may just compartmentalize it. You may put it in a part of your brain that you hope you never go to again. And there's also the fear of reliving the trauma. And in the beginning of trauma work, back in the, as you say, in the 80s, when I first started, we had an unfortunate habit, I'll call it, because we didn't have any other tool, of having people relive this trauma, which was reinforcing the trauma rather than getting rid of it. And we had, particularly with women in sexual abuse, if something happened in the family, we had people never speak to the family again. And, it just things did not get resolved. And we now know, after all these years, we finally got it. And we're doing much better in helping people really heal from trauma. And that's what we're talking about. And one of the other things that I think can be laid out right in the beginning, even how the EMDR is done has changed. One of the things I was looking at right from the beginning is say, let me stop for a minute and ask Jonathan if you could describe what goes on in an EMDR session.
Yeah, so I'm coming at it from a client perspective or a patient perspective, which might be helpful for some people out there. And before I get into that, last week was a pretty emotional show, and went through a lot of the trauma that I had been through. And when you address trauma, more so after talk therapy, talk therapy can get you to a certain point. And if there's like this dark spot in your memory, like that something happened, but you can't quite distinguish what it was. It's kind of like trying to remember what you dreamt last night. You can remember like bits and pieces of it, but the main crux of it, that's the part that EMDR really targets. And so when you go through the talk therapy, you're building up to this point, and your counselor and your therapist will see these dark points, and you will know that there's a dark point there. You'll be like, man, I'm trying to remember something, and I just can't remember the specifics. I know there was this person there and that person there, and this happened and that happened, but it's kind of all a jumbled mess. And so what EMDR... And
in fact, that's a protective mechanism in the brain.
That's exactly right.
Because, if you were able to access it immediately and you don't have any protective thing, that can be traumatizing again.
That's right.
And that's what you want to avoid.
Yeah, and trying to do this without a trained professional is can be very dangerous. I'm just going to put that there. So really what you're doing in that talk therapy is you're first identifying what that is. So you're going through this assessment and prep time. After you have kind of assessed what that preparation is, you're going to go through a phase of targeting memories. And this is probably, at least for me, the most kind of re-traumatizing or most intense aspect of it, because what the client is going to do is typically they're going to sit, at least for me, I sat in a chair with my feet firmly on the floor, my hands on my knees, just sitting as I kind of normally would. But then we would start to focus on a particular memory or a sensation or a particular, like that bad thing, those bad thoughts, and really feeling what my emotions are and diving into those emotions and being angry and scared and sad and depressed and really trying to feel all of those things. Because when you get into that mode, then it starts what's called bilateral stimulation. And what that is you either have a sound that is ticking and your eyes are going to go back and forth in whatever direction the therapist wants you to go. It can be either up or down. It can be diagonal, side to side. But bilateral means it's going to go from one side to the other, whether it be opposite. It just has to be opposite. And what this does is it kind of acts as a pillow or a buffer between your conscious person and the emotions and things that you are feeling at the same time. So you're really able to sit in both places at the same time, which is kind of why therapists will say we need to go have a conversation with our younger self, the childlike self, which is very interesting when you think about it on its surface. Well, how do I go have a conversation with my younger self? This is how you do it. So once I started engaging in that, the bilateral stimulation, when you're feeling all of these things, it's I don't want to get, it's almost like you're in a trance state.
Right.
Where
it's somewhat hypnotic.
Yes, very much. You can see yourself talking to your other self, which is a weird kind of trippy thing. And it's amazing how powerful the brain is. And what this does is you become the third party to your own conversations between your older self and your younger self. Your older self is looking at your younger self saying, hey, look, I know you've been through a really hard time, and here's what we're going to do. And all this whole time, your therapist is coaching you on what to say. How are you feeling? They're kind of re-engaging with you. But for me, it was allowing me to explore kind of that conversation that I wanted to have with my younger self. And what this does is this helps the brain reprocess that memory and pulls, not the right word. It brings along the child and coaches them and guides them into a better place of healing and discovery, where that child then now becomes free to be themselves. And sometimes that may take one session, sometimes it may take two, and sometimes it may take 4 or 5. But I would highly encourage you that if you are going to do an EMDR session, hold on, before I get into that, once you bring that person or that little self out of that trauma situation, you're kind of dealing with that, you're processing it. Then there's this part of installation. Once that distress that's been kind of associated with that memory decreases, that therapist is then going to help that client or myself focus on the positive belief related to that memory. So if in my situation, it was my teacher abused me.
Right.
I'm not, I was saying, I'm not safe. I'm not strong. I'm a coward. I'm weak. I'm not smart. Then that child is now telling themselves, I am strong. I am safe now. I am free to be the man that I am. I am free to be the person that I am. And you guide that child into your current state of being. For me, it was that state of manhood. And then to be able to come out of that, you do, or at least I did, a full body scan, asking, my therapist asked me, to start in my toes, to feel my toes, to re-engage with my body, because right now you're so far into your mind that nothing feels real. It's a weird, trippy experience. And so to re-engage with your body, you get your feet on the floor, at least mine was. You put your feet on the floor, re-engage with your toes first, and then start to slowly move back up into your body and back into your brain. But I will say this. If you go to an EMDR session, please do it, if you can, in the morning. This is what I did. Do it in the morning and take the day off.
Right.
It's hard going through that trauma. It can be scary. And so I would just really, really encourage you to make sure that when you're going through an EMDR session, that you give yourself at least a week between each session and then take the day off. Ideally, if you can do it on a Friday, fantastic. Because then you'll have all weekend to really sit with yourself and process. But at least take that initial day off. Bill, what do you want to add to that?
Well, what I want to add to that, when you think about it, see, your body has been fighting so long to prevent these memories to come back. Mm-hmm. And in fact, even the child has been trying to, has not been free to be a child, but really guarding the memory. Mm-hmm. And if you remember some of the previous programs, I've talked about the parent, adult, and child. Those are the three states which we all need to have, but it has to be the carefree child. It has to be the nurturing parent, and it has to be the intelligent, intellectual adult, rather than the critical parent or the scared kid. And so consequently, part of what EMDR is, by releasing those negative memories and, as we say, reprocessing them, then we take away the power of those memories to block us from being who we are.
Yep.
And which also, because that is so powerful, we have to trust the therapist. Otherwise, we're going to continue to block. We're going to continue to prevent the therapist from doing anything because it's scary. Otherwise, we wouldn't have kept it so long in this kind of box.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're spending a bit of time with the EMDR, because it's effective, but there are certain caveats that we're giving you to help you understand. And yes, you have to take some time off and just allow yourself to embrace the new self, which is the playful kid, to embrace, and really understand the work that you've done to heal. Because we're talking about healing.
Well, before we move on, I want to make the quick statement that when you're going through this EMDR therapy, or you're in actually talk therapy, which is just the classic sit on a couch, sit on a chair, talk with your therapist, kind of navigate what those are. If your therapist is recommending EMDR, please take that very seriously, because your therapist is trained to see dark spots that you may not be able to see. And by what you say, how you say it, what you're going through, you should absolutely heed their advice in taking EMDR. And I know we're making this sound like a big, very hairy, scary thing. Yeah. Which initially it is, but I can guarantee you on the other side of EMDR therapy is a light that is so bright, you'll be like, what in the world have I been missing for the last 20, 15, 20, 30 years? It's incredible.
Exactly.
It's so incredible.
There's another piece we haven't mentioned. You were describing the eye movement, and some of our listeners who are blind said, well, that wouldn't apply to me. One of the things that EMDR has developed, and in fact I've used is a device where there are two parts. You hold two devices in your hand, which are to a wire that the therapist handles, and that is where the clicking occurs.
Right.
In the two devices, and therefore your eyes will still, that movement will occur just simply by the process of the rhythm back and forth. And the therapist can speed it up or slow it down depending on what's working for you.
Right.
But you have the sensation in your hand, which then helps your eye movement to do the work it needs to do.
And actually, and to add on to that, one thing that I did personally was, in conjunction with EMDR, was metronome therapy. And so it takes that eye movement and it pairs it with another physical response, in this case, listening. And so if you are blind, one thing that your therapist may do is have two speakers on either side of you and play a very low click on each side of you. So it sounds like a tick-tock. So it's like click, clock, click. And depends on.
So the thing is, for our folks who are low vision or whatever, EMDR, they've made accommodations for us in order to be effective and work around, what you may feel or some people may feel is a limitation. We can do that once you've done all the preliminary work with your therapist, and that we can't. And plus, you have the work to do after the therapist,
right?
After the EMDR with the therapist in processing and in getting the work done. And as Jonathan has said last week, he really didn't feel fully resolved until he got to the forgiveness.
Yep.
And that was a process that came from another way, and that was powerful for him to be able to do that. And there's a lot to be said for the forgiveness, because that's the only way that you can that may be the only way you can let it go.
Yeah.
Once you forgive the person, doesn't mean that you forget it, doesn't mean that the person may be suffering some other place.
Yeah.
But the fact is, you release it, because the work has nothing to do with the perpetrator.
Right.
The work is within you. The perpetrator will have to deal with him or herself, but you do the work to release yourself from the grip of the trauma.
Absolutely. Well, so far, this show has been very heavy. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite that little kid back in, because I when you go through that forgiveness aspect and you go through the peace journey, there's kind of I almost want to say it's kind of like a grieving time where you're not quite sure.
Grieving.
You're not quite sure which person you are. You're not familiar with this old, fun-loving, goofy self, if that's your personality. For me, it was. And you start to become in touch with that goofball again, or that person who enjoys doing a particular thing, like playing with model trains or cars, or just enjoying life, going on walks, or getting outside. But when I went through and I started to re-engage with that kid, I started doing a lot of different things. My hobbies became very eclectic. I started knife making. I started getting more into hunting. I started more camping and being with my kids, and home interior design and decorating and cooking. I love cooking, and I didn't until like 2019, 2020. And I was like, man, I kind of really enjoy this. And I had enjoyed it before, but now it's like I can be really creative with all these different foods, and I was creative with music and audio and all. It's the creative person inside of me that needed to get out. And because now that person is out, I can be creative in so many different avenues and aspects. And when you get to invite that little kid back into your life, you become a incredibly powerful person. and you become well-rounded, you become exciting, you become engaged, you become yourself, who your true self is, and you don't have to worry really about who you are anymore, because you don't need to allow people to influence who you are. And it's a freeing emotional experience that you have to learn to be in. And it takes time. And that's why it's so important to have therapy bookend your EMDR sessions so that you can kind of reprocess some of those things and live beyond anything that you have ever done.
And you see, the thing is, even with people who haven't gone through trauma, they may grow up in families where children aren't allowed to be children.
Absolutely.
And, so we have to be taught sometimes how to be a child. And sometimes that's a difficult thing for parents to allow kids to be kids because they've been taught that you can't do that. And you say, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Now, what you're doing is accessing that kid within you, that playful kid in you is as much an important part of you as the critical parent or the adult, if not more important, because
that's right.
That's where our creativity comes from. And boy, are people, a lot of us have gone through the times when we weren't just allowed to be kids.
Absolutely.
And that's what had to change.
Well, and I know we're running up against time, but I want to share one final story. Yesterday,
sure,
I was standing with a lady who, I was picking up my kids, and I was standing next to a lady, and we were both commenting on how much energy children have. And I had the realization, and, parents always say, or most of the time parents say, man, if I could just bottle that energy, or if I could just have a little portion of that energy, it's if I could then, the classic if-then statement. And in my head, I was walking away and I'm thinking, well, why don't I just go play? Why, if working out gives me energy, yeah, I'm sore afterwards, I might be tired, but it gives my body that energy, and then I can play even more. We use the excuse of, I'm an adult, they're kids, they have natural energy. We as adults have been conditioned to have zero energy. We've been conditioned to sit at our desks. We've been conditioned to do what we've been told. We've been conditioned to stay in rows, stay in lines, do it. And we have forgotten how to play. And I actually think adults need to go through play therapy, which is exactly what children go through when they're kids.
Right.
So that's my little plug for adults being kids.
Absolutely. And a really important thing, if you have a pet, you got to learn to play because the dog wants you to play. And, my dog looks at me and says, oh, Daddy, come on.
I know.
But it is important because that's as much a part of us as the adult and parent. Is that child part where we can play, be goofy, whatever. Some people are a little uncomfortable being around it, but that's their problem. That's not yours. And to be free. So we're talking a lot about EMDR because that's a major piece of trauma therapy.
Yeah.
But before you get there, there's a lot of steps like cognitive therapy where we begin to learn and to look at ourselves in a different way. This is all having to do with looking at ourselves in a different way, in a supportive way, instead of punishing ourselves like perhaps our parents did.
Yep.
And saying, okay, this is, I can do this, and kind of reinforcing what we can do rather than what we can't do.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been a little bit about trauma. I'm sure we'll come back to this subject in other podcasts, but we hope that this has been helpful for people who have suffered trauma to know that they don't have to continue to suffer, that it's helpful, it's not going to it's going to manage the healing.
Yeah.
It's not like punishing ourselves. It's to manage the healing so that we can be free again, or maybe free for the first time. This is Bill Lundgren and Jonathan Price. The episode for Blindsight. We look forward to being with you again. If you have some feedback for us, don't hesitate to call the feedback line at 720-712-8856 or send us an email at feedback@aftersight.org. Thank you for being with us.